All financial support for this podcast comes from my patrons on patreon.com. If you'd like to join in with the patrons, please check out patreon.com/Darwin Gross. That's DARWINGROSSE. Now enjoy the podcast. Okay, today I have the great opportunity to speak to somebody who was actually introduced to me by one of the listeners. His name's Jon Sonnenberg, and he has got quite a story to tell. Whether you are interested in someone who has a pod studio with tons of crazy gear, if you're interested in talking to someone who's in the I Dream of Wires video, or if you're interested in somebody who makes bizarro instrumentation, they're all embodied in this one person. Additionally, though, he does some fabulous music. And so with that, I am going to introduce Jon Sonnenberg. Hey, Jon, how's it going?
Great.
Thank you so much for taking the time to have this discussion here on the day after Christmas. That's when we're recording. And it's kind of early in the morning, but it's nice. We're both kind of early risers, so we get to start the day with this great conversation. I really appreciate it, man.
Oh, my gosh. Thank you so much for having me on the show. It means a lot.
Oh, well, thanks a lot. Why don't we start off by having you talk a little bit about some of the projects that you do. I mean, with just even a basic amount of review, it's pretty stunning to see all the different things that you have sort of accomplished in your musical journey. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you consider your work?
It's funny that I look back and sometimes I look at this volume of work that I've done, whether it's recording or instruments that I've built. And I think like I've accomplished so little compared to Mozart or Jesus Christ or somebody like that just had, was able to accomplish so many things by the time they were like 30. And so sometimes I look back and I think I haven't done anything at all, and that I still have a lot to get done. I always have projects around the studio that are unfinished, bins and bins of different projects and things that I have thought about or am working on. But ultimately, it all comes back to music that I want to make and what I want to accomplish, what devices I want to make or what equipment I need to buy to accomplish that end goal that's been ringing in my head or the ideas in my mind.
Right. That's actually really interesting. Now, one of the things I'm curious about in that discussion is the development of instruments. One of the things that I actually found really fascinating was some of the things you've done that sort of like crossed the mechanical electronic border, right? You have the thing with sort of like the magnetic but otherworldly little arm that's hanging down that kind of runs between nodes and stuff like that. But you have like physical triggering systems, all kinds of stuff. Talk a little bit about those things, because I think that that represents sort of a cutting edge of the future. It's this kind of mechanical to electronic interface is really a big part of what can make electronic stuff instrument-like, right?
There's two aspects of that, really. There's the process of sound through acoustic sources, like the opposite of electromechanical instruments, when you have electro instruments and then you're working backwards, you're sending electronics through acoustic resonators. For instance, if you have a violin sample and you send it actually through maybe a talk box into the body of a violin and then mic that to get the resonances and the sound of the wood into the recording, there's that aspect of these instruments that I do a lot with. My reverbs, I don't really use plate reverbs anymore or anything like that. I'm using bird cages because they sound amazing. And I still have a lot of effects processors and 4 different spring reverbs that I like to use, but nothing sounds as good as some of these other techniques that I've just kind of adopted and used in my studio. And then there's the aspect of what I call sample-proof instruments, and that's kind of my main agenda right now, I would say, is I started thinking a lot about why people are still willing to pay $5,000 for a Mellotron or $2,000 for a Rhodes. And don't get me wrong, I have 8 electric pianos. I'm really interested in electromechanical devices as well as synthesis and analog and digital techniques and things like that.
Right.
But, people, despite how many, terabytes of sample data we can use, or modeling, or whatever you want to, whatever, DAW and soft synths you want to bring to the table, people are still willing to pay a lot for the originals. And it really comes down to 3 things. It comes down to aesthetics. It comes down to the feel of the instruments, because, a harpsichord doesn't feel like a piano, doesn't feel like a Hammond organ, even though they're all keyboard instruments. And it comes down to the sound. And a lot of electroacoustical instruments have these nuances and these things that happen that you just can't easily recreate. And it even leads to, this Hammond, even though it's the same model, doesn't sound exactly like this Hammond.
Right. I was going to say that definitely was my experience with Rhodes pianos, is the variety. I mean, not only from model to model, but even within models. Sometimes it'll be how well they were maintained or how much time they spent in a storage locker in Louisiana or whatever, But all of those kind of environmental things can have a very significant impact on the sound of something electromechanical like a Rhodes.
Sure. And they're adjustable too. You can go inside and you can change where that tine hits the pickup, and you can offset a little for a harder Rhodes sound, or you can make it more of a bell-like sound. And but I take that even further. Like my Kawai 608 piano, for instance, I'm constantly doing things with that. Like, a guitarist will finger a string and play a harmonic. So I have a bar that goes all the way across the strings, and although it makes the instrument an octave higher, it's basically a harmonic piano. And one of the nice things about it is, that particular electric piano has 1 string per note. So it's not like a CP 70 or 60 where you have 2 strings per note.
Right.
Or like a real piano where you may have 3 strings per note. It's easier to manipulate. Although my CP60, I have this harpsichord bar from the 70s that is like these. It makes it into like a thumbtack piano, but with a little lever, I can just remove it and go back to the CP60 sound. So even the stuff that I have that I would say is unique sounding, I always look for ways to make it even more unique sounding.
Yeah, well, that actually reminds me too of like some of the, before synthesizers were widely available, some of the sort of like mods that people would do to these electromechanical devices. My favorite was always the whammy bar that would be installed on a clavinet.
Yes.
To sort of give, for people who just like really missed the guitaristic whammy bar, that always gave them an opportunity to do that. I just thought that was interesting. But even like things like the old stories about the the Tin Pan Alley piano players who would have, they really only ever played anything on the black keys. So they had like knee levers that would allow them to do key shifts, right?
Sure.
And
sure.
These kind of modifications, I think a lot of people abandon that because sort of conceptually modifying something now is considered the world of software, not hardware.
Right. And I think that's kind of a tragedy because I think that there's a lot of unexplored territories in just simple acoustics and electromagnetic instruments. So one of the devices that I made recently that's still in process, but I presented it at KnobCon this last year, is my instrument. It's simply called Sample Proof Instrument Number 1. And it takes the idea of sample proofing an instrument, which doesn't have anything to do with high frequency encoding that screws up your sampler when you try to sample it. It's all about an instrument that's so arbitrary in nature that every time you turn it on, it sounds different.
Right.
And every note that you play sounds different. And the way I accomplish this is the idea behind this instrument is, if you're not familiar with the Hammond organ or the tone wheel organ, of course, it's like a guitar string vibrates across an electromagnetic pickup back and forth. A Hammond wheel is more like a gear. It spins, and as the teeth go pass by, it creates that wave shape. Well, this instrument uses a container full of BBs. And as the BBs spin around, that creates the waveform. So it's a one octave instrument, and each note has a separate container that's spinning at a different frequency, using gears and microprocessor to control the speed of the motors and things.
Sure.
So all of these things are spinning around at different rates in the 12-note scale that we have. But every time you turn it on, these BBs will cluster in slightly different orders. Furthermore, it's in development. Like I said, I have a lot of projects that I have made great efforts. I mean, this particular one I've been developing for about 4 or 5 years. So it's not something that I just thought of and threw together, a motor in a container. This thing has a hand-carved, hand-shaved aluminum keyboard. I'll get into my background in a second, but I work at a contract manufacturing place that makes thousands of circuit boards, thousands of electronic assemblies, daily, weekly. And sometimes I just want to come home and do the equivalent of sitting on a rocking chair, whittling a piece of wood.
Right.
So, and making something really unique and something that I'm proud of and something that can't easily be reproduced. So not only is the sound sample proof, in my opinion, but I would never make a second one. There's instruments that I've made in the past that I've shown people, and they're like, how much for one of these,
Right.
And there's no way. I've already made one.
Yeah.
I already made the one I wanted. so in some ways, I don't mean to be elitist or anything. It's not that I think other people don't deserve this type of work or this type of instrument. It's just, it's so time consuming, and every process is a whole different thought process. And I like doing things the hard way. Like I said, if I need to file a piece of aluminum for 2 months, then I'm doing that. So ultimately, the hand craftsmanship part of this is also part of the instruments that I make that I think are important.
Yeah, it sounds like that's equally, yeah, it's equally part of the instrument creation. It's not just the ideation of how the sound is going to be made, but it's literally the process you go through in making it that is part of the instrument design, right?
Sure. And it also goes back to I electronic music has come to a point, and even some of the Behringer models that come out, it's so inexpensive to have a fairly great studio today. The stuff that I'm interested in making is definitely stuff that just isn't available. It's just conceptual, and nobody makes anything like it.
Right. So, one of the things I like doing in my podcast is talking to people about their background. And I'm curious about yours because, frankly, you have this really interesting intersection of a lot of stuff. You have the ability to not only to make your own instrumentation, but as you kind of mentioned here, to actually, in a very fine way, make kind of impeccable looking instruments. Anybody who wants to take a quick review of some of your YouTube stuff will get a chance to see some amazing instrumentation that you've put together. But beyond that, you also through a couple of different band or artist name things. We'll get into this later, but you've done a number of different releases of some very accomplished music. So you clearly have a strong musical background as well. And I'm curious where, what your background is and how you get to be the artist and builder and thinker and inventor that you are, because it's an amazing collection of talents that you bring to the table. So how did you get there? What's your background, and how did you get to be the person that you are today?
So musically, I grew up in a somewhat musical family, although many people will say that my dad can't jam because when he gets together with other musicians, he's always the person that kind of has to lead everything and everybody follows him.
Okay.
But I grew up in a family where my mom played piano, my dad played fiddle. He was more in the bluegrass and things like that I didn't appreciate for a long time. But my mom still talks about, when I was 6 years old, she was trying to play a Mozart piece, and I would go over and play it better than she was playing. It was one of those things. I've always played, even though I took classical lessons for 12, 13 years, it was one of those things that I always played better by ear. For me to sight read a piece of music, it's just not going to happen. I have to study it. Mm-hmm. I have to study it measure by measure and go through. But it's also one of those things that once I've played a Schubert or Chopin piece or something like that and studied it, I never forget it. I still can play things that I played, 20 years ago, like the music would be in front of me. So I grew up in this musical setting, but I also really started collecting records and started with 45s. I think my first records were probably like Hall & Oates and AC/DC and things like that. But
right. Sure.
Soon after, when the 80s really fell into play and all of these interesting sounds on synthesizers were in the mainstream, Human League, Howard Jones, Thompson Twins, just to name a few, the pop music of the 80s really, really Talking Heads. I mean, if you listen to some of these bands, they were really experimenting with some sounds, and the palette of sounds sonically was really interesting. And I think a lot of that's died, or maybe we just think this is what a synthesizer should sound like, and so we just get into this idea that analog synths are always subtractive. All the East Coast, West Coast mythology that we get caught up in. and what an analog synth should sound like, what a Buchla synth should sound like. To me, it's all kind of nonsense, to be honest, because there are many, many, many other methods to synthesize sound than just subtractive or FM or running a low pass gate or, you know, I mean, and different manufacturers over the years have come up with different strategies, phase modulation, vowel consonant synthesis, a lot of things like that. So through the 80s, I bought my first synthesizer. I had a couple Casios before this, but I bought my first Juno 60 when I was in the 6th grade, and it was 1984, I'd say. So I think the 106 just came out. Maybe it was 85. No, it would have been 84 because I had it when I went to NAMM, the NAMM show for the first time. So I had an uncle that was, he owned a, you know, like I said, my dad was in the bluegrass. My uncle owned a music store in Helena, Montana, and I lived in Orange County. It was worlds difference, but my uncle would, you know, compete in the Montana State Fiddle Championship and do these things, and also own this music store, and would come down to Los Angeles, come down to Orange County, and go to the NAMM show. And one year, he took me, and I was in junior high, and granted, by this time I already had a small collection of keyboard magazines, and most of the cool-looking synthesizers had been cut out, and I had, you know, I was the kid
taped down the wall, right?
Exactly. So I had the Kurzweil 250 on the wall. I had the Synclavier on the wall. I knew what all of these things were, even in junior high. And when I went to the NAMM show, I don't know who was who. I don't know if Stevie Wonder walked by me. I had no idea. This is 1984. But I do know that I saw really cool, interesting instruments. I know that I saw this in Synclavier. I know that I saw stuff at the Roland booth. And I know that I was told to stop playing those congas when I walked by, because I was just a kid, you know.
Right,
he's not going to buy anything. So, and it's a trade show. So a lot of people just assumed I didn't know what I was talking about or doing. But I was also the kid that would beg my dad to take me to a music store, you know, and we'd go to a music store and I'd talk the salesman's ear off about synthesis and synthesizers, to where when we're driving home, my dad would just be like, yeah, that salesman didn't know what he was talking about, or, you know. And it also got to the point where when people started buying synthesizers, you know, it sounds weird today because I have so much equipment and I've collected so much. And to say that I grew up without a whole lot of extra spending money and not a lot of, it's almost laughable with the amount of equipment that I have. But it was also the 80s and people were getting rid of stuff for really cheap.
Mm-hmm.
And all I could afford were the SH-101s and the Juno 60s at the time, when what I really wanted was like the ESQ1, the Ensoniq, or the, you know, the emulator, things like this. And so, but my dad would always say to me, understand and be able to do more with the equipment that you have than the manufacturers ever intended. And so, like on the Juno 60, not a lot of people understand that there's patches and banks beyond 60s and 70s. There's an 80s and 90s bank. You can easily just put a light sensitive resistor right across the VCF input and have light sensitive, you know, control over the filter.
Right.
There's a lot that you can do with it. My favorite thing about the Juno 60 still to this day is the external patch shift input, which was really borrowed by, you know, from the Sequential Circuits 700 programmer idea, where you can step through the patches with a clock. It's brilliant because with a synchronized clock pulse from a drum machine or something, you can change the patch every time you send it a clock pulse. So it's not just for use with a pedal that, you're playing live and you want to switch from one sound to the next, which is, I think, what it was intended for.
Right, yeah.
But you can actually have a sequence of notes with a totally different envelope, sequence of chords with a totally different envelope per stage of the sequence. And, there's a lot of things like that. So by the time I was in high school, anybody who did buy an ESQ1 or a DX7, 5, 21, whatever the numbers were at the time, and then even through the Korg M1T and the T series and the Roland D series, a lot of that stuff I never bought. But I was so into programming at that time that people would loan me equipment for months at a time. And I would just have it in my studio. Often I'd have twice as much gear as what I owned because people would just drop off their synthesizers, because I would be able to use it and record with it and learn it, but I was also giving them new patches.
Right.
That they didn't have to program. So there was a lot of that going on. And also right after high school, by the time I graduated high school, I had a Jupiter 8, I had a Juno 60, I had a Yamaha CS20, and it was all bought cheap or given to me, or just, just incredible deals that I won't really talk about here. But there's also a lot of things that, like I remember seeing a 909 for $125, and I couldn't afford it. It wasn't something that I had that kind of money to buy, or a TR-808 for $400 that I just, was sitting in a corner of a music store, and I was just I knew what it was. I thought it was cool. I would have loved to have bought it at the time, but I just didn't have the cash, and I think musicians are usually notoriously broke in a lot of ways.
Yeah, right.
And it surprises me how many people have jumped on the Eurorack bandwagon, because it's not necessarily the cheapest route to some of these ideas, especially when there's so much MIDI single U rack mount stuff that's really powerful, that can do a lot. It's just not as sexy. It's just not as easily editable.
Right. Well, I think too that there's, to a certain extent, some of the thing that makes Eurorack really interesting is that you can sort of, even at a relatively low music budget, you have the ability to sort of piece together your own adventure with it, right?
That's true.
Like month at a time, you can afford to just like squeeze enough out of your budget to maybe get a module, or for one of the big modules, you have to save up for a couple of months, but it's consumable in that way. Now, it's interesting to hear you talk about sort of like collecting things in the 80s when people were bailing. And I think nowadays people are like, why would anyone have sold a Jupiter 8 for a couple of $100? I think it's hard for people to remember that this is back when, when the DX7 came out, it was so ubiquitous. If you wanted to think of yourself having a recording career, you had to have the sound of the DX7. And so that was like $1,300. And so if you had to sell a couple of your old analog dinosaurs to come up with $1,200, you'd do it, and it really gave people like you the opportunity to get access to these amazing, amazing instruments.
Right. And also, I've never sold anything.
Good for you, I guess.
That's not necessarily true. I've sold some duplicates over the years of things that I've had. But so by the time I was in high school and out of high school, I already knew a lot about electronic music. And I started really looking into the history, started collecting a lot of books, took some classes at the local college where they had an ARP 2600. I remember the lab had like 4 D50s, Roland D50s, and then they had an ARP 2600 in the corner. And that's the thing that I gravitated towards, because most of my studio at the time, I thought in CV and gate. That's what I had. And when I did borrow a MIDI device, I wasn't really MIDIing it up to anything. I didn't really have any reason for that. You know, the sequencers that I use and still use to this day, I love the MSQ 700s. Even though those are MIDI devices, I typically use like the DCB connection to the Juno 60 or the DCB connection to the Jupiter and just sync them up with DynSync. Even when I do sequence in MIDI, I typically use CV to MIDI converters.
Oh, interesting.
That convert a lot of the stuff. Now, I'm also a player, so I do play a lot of rack mount devices. You know, I have an EMU, the E4XT Ultra sampler. Like, you know, I have a pretty large library of stuff for that I'll call up a preset and play on a weighted 88 keyboard. But for the most part, I don't really use MIDI a whole lot. I just use the keyboard that's built into whatever instrument. And if I'm sequencing, it's almost always in triggers and gates. And if I'm triggering a sample, it's almost always through like a CV and gate to MIDI interface. I have the Roland OP8M, which is a pretty early CV to MIDI interface. And so, you know, I'll use things like that before I sequence something in a computer. I use my computer a lot, but I use it for Pro Tools and, you know, recording.
As an enhanced tape recorder, basically.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to me, though, because the sequencers like the MSQ 700 and items like that, you say you're a player, but these things are almost the antithesis of player devices, where you're oftentimes like entering step lengths in clocks, you know, clock ticks, and you're, you know, in some of the older cases, you're even entering numbers in octal and stuff. I mean, these sequencers, while they were amazing at the time, also were sort of like, I would say player adverse because it was like a very intellectualized way of entering music. And, you know, players oftentimes have a very emotional way of playing. And I'm just wondering how you kind of mesh the two ways of thinking about music making.
That's an interesting question. I don't know that I have a really good answer for it because, you know, there's a time when I was doing entire songs using nothing but an MC202 and, you know, SH101 sequencers. I still love just the 100-note sequencer in the SH101 or the 40 whatever note sequencer in the Pro One, Sequential Circuits Pro One. I use a lot of just really rudimentary step sequencers like that and then clock them with syncopated clocks to get other rhythms. I still do things like that. I mean, I used things like Fruity Loops and Digital Performer and Ableton, and I've used some programs over the years that I just always go back to, like simple sequencers on analog equipment. To me, it just makes more sense for some reason.
Sure. That's really interesting. Now, one of the things that I actually really enjoyed when I was doing a bit of research on you is on your SoundCloud page. You have examples of your music, but you also have these commentaries where you actually like verbally walk through the process of making a song. And it was interesting to me because despite the fact that you talk about, you know, using these rudimentary step sequencers and stuff, there's a lot about your development of songs that kind of is a throwback to more traditional songwriting things, like finding a set of chord changes that speak to you, and then like letting that marinate in your head while you develop what, you know, internally becomes the voice for a piece or whatever. I found that a really fascinating thing because I think a lot of times people are almost suspicious of trying to explain how they make music, and you seem to be like very willing to share the process. I thought that was quite amazing.
You know, for a long time I felt like there should be some mystery about it, and there should be some secrecy about the art.
Right.
However, I think that we've come so far to where there's so much public knowledge of different things out there that you give 100 people a mini Moog and nobody is going to do the same thing with it. Nobody's going to make the same music with it. Nobody is going to make the same sounds. They might make the same type of sounds. They might remember like a Keith Emerson lick or something and play something like that along with it, or play the Doctor Who theme or something. But most everybody is going to do something different with it. And that goes for guitar too. Think about how many singer-songwriters there are out there. And granted, a lot of them sound the same and maybe are in the same styles, but there are some really unique, talented people that are just using their voice and guitar. And so I don't worry so much about people copying a style. I don't think anybody cares that much. I think they're more interested in the process in a lot of ways than they are in the music, to be honest. When you do a video of your music and then you do a video of a synthesizer demo, and I've known a lot of artists who will do stuff like this as an experiment. Go figure that the synthesizer video gets 20 times the amount of views than the thing that you're pouring your heart and soul out into. I got remarried a couple years ago, and I married into a family where now I have a 9 and 10-year-old kid. It's interesting to watch how adept they are with technology and how much YouTube videos they watch and how they just care about, the I generation. I feel like I'm the opposite of the I generation. Like, the I generation has little content, but they're constantly making videos. I have unlimited content and ideas and thoughts about things, but so little time to do any kind of promotion. So the times that I do put an 8-minute clip or something, I want it to be meaningful. I want to talk about, the process that I have in writing a song, because I think that's more important sometimes than the song itself.
Well, and that's the thing that actually is going to provide something to, I guess it's, the modern word for it is it's evergreen, right? It's something that's going to be valuable even generations from now, because process is something that is a curiosity for everybody. I mean, it's kind of at the heart of why I do this podcast, because I actually am really curious about the background, but also the process that people go through in whatever form of art they're developing, whether it's building instruments or it's writing music or it's doing visual art or whatever. I'm really curious by this combination of background and how that background ends up informing the process that becomes somebody's working environment. Now, in your case, one of the things I would say is that in addition to working with a lot of amazing hardware that you've collected, you do have a certain amount of your work that is dependent on sort of custom instrumentation. And it goes back to this idea of creating sample-proof instruments, things that are so idiosyncratic that sampling them is kind of a joke, right?
Right.
And so, but also there are things like in the I Dream of Wires video, they show you interacting with a modular that you had bought off of somebody, a hand-built thing that was, it had a very kind of unique and distorted sound, and it was clear that that was something that spoke to you, right? In other cases, controller-like items you used were were important to you in terms of how you would develop a melody, because this like swinging arm thing would react in certain ways and would sort of like draw certain melodies out of you, right?
Sure.
I'm curious to what extent these kinds of things, you mentioned before that you actually kind of have an idea in your head and it draws these instruments out of you. And the creating of the instrument can take some time. But what I'm wondering is, how often do you find that you have a musical idea in your head and you have to make an instrument? And how often does it happen that you have an instrumental idea, and then when you actually create an instance of it, it generates a new song or a new set of songs for you? Which way does it kind of go?
I think it usually starts in my head, or me just playing an idea on a keyboard or something, or humming a tune. For me, music, I'm probably going to make a lot of enemies saying this on your podcast. But, okay, somebody who makes a sequence or a little idea on, scraping a chair across the floor, it's definitely musical. I'm not saying that that's not music. But there's a distinction between music and a song. And for me, a song, the definition of a song that I've always used, is something that can be covered and recognized again on a different instrument. So if you can take a song and use another instrument and recreate that song or that melody, that's, to me, what makes a good song. And so that idea is always in my head whenever I'm writing or making music. The end goal is always a song, something that can be recognized and covered,
sure,
if so to speak.
Yeah, well, that's actually interesting, because you say you might make a lot of enemies, and I don't know that it's enemies that you'd make. It's just, for a lot of people, they'd be like, I can't imagine doing that, right? Because there does seem to be this kind of split, which is a lot of people who love to do music that is sort of like structured sound design work, or something like that, and other people who are making songs that might have vocals or might not, might have specific instrumentation stuff. But this idea that the definition or the defining fact idea of a song being whether it could be covered, say, by an acoustic guitar, is actually a really interesting way to think of it.
I think a lot of people lose that kind of definition because they get so lost in the noodling. They get so lost in like, oh, this is a great sound, I should record it. And it doesn't really become anything beyond that great sound. And, a lot of things that I develop, I think even in those recordings that I have of the process of my work, there are some songs where I start with a really interesting, provocative sound that I think is just pulling me in. And in the final mix, it doesn't even make it. It doesn't even appear in the song at the end, because I've steered the song away from that idea. And I think
it
it's
influenced
okay.
the development of the song, but it wasn't necessarily part of it in the end.
It's okay to explore and evolve a song like that. I will say this: after industrial music came out and the goth industrial scene came out, I was certainly influenced by a lot of those bands too, all the 4AD things, all the shoegazer bands. That first Tiergarten record, the Center Bullet, really changed my whole perspective on the way I was listening to and approaching music. But it's always been song-oriented. Even through all the Skinny Puppy records that I would listen to, I was always more interested in the songs and the textures behind the songs that were creating these songs, rather than just the sounds themselves.
Interesting. Well, Jon, I can't believe it, but our time is already up, and I feel like we just got started with our discussion. But before I go, I just have one more question I'd like to ask you. And one of the things, again, another thing I ran across when I was checking out your website, which is Art of Travelogue, by the way. For people who want to learn more about you, I think that's artoftravelogue.blogspot.com is probably the easiest way to get there.
Sure.
Is that in there you talk about having done some musical creations for games. And it seems to me like developing music for games is almost the antithesis of a song, because if you make things that are too easily recognizable or whatever, they can kind of get to be an irritant in the middle of playing a game, right? How do you balance this kind of desire to create songs with the need or the desire to create music for video games?
It's definitely a different approach. I've done music for films. I've done music for video games. Most of those opportunities have all been presented from fans. Like I said, I'm very, it's not that I'm lazy about going out and self-promoting. It's that I have so many ideas that I want to focus on that I rarely have time to even blink. And so when somebody comes and approaches me and says, hey, I'd really love it if you could do this video game that I'm developing, the soundtrack to the video game that I'm developing. And pretty soon one turns into 3 video games and you have, 23 to 40 songs on each one. It's definitely a different type of challenge because a lot of those songs were like a minute or 2 long and then they loop. So it's definitely more of an idea of how can I make something interesting that's more than just a background drone that people can appreciate as a song, but it's not ignored.
Right.
So yeah, there's a balance there, and I think just coming up with even the ideas behind some of those. 2 things that I will mention, like there was a song on one of those. I'm not in the microtonal music, but there was a melody on one of those tracks on one of the video games where I needed to do this like descending scale, and the amount of notes in the sequence and the amount of spaces in the 12-note scale didn't match up. So I ended up doing quarter note, like quarter tones.
Oh, sure.
Within there to make it work.
To fit in the timing, right, yeah.
So I do things like that. I think about puzzles like that when I'm working on things like that, to that level. And as far as making instruments, to answer your previous question, like a sound in my head, I really love auto harps and I really love wind chimes. And for years I was trying to figure out how I could make an auto harp chime. And what I ended up doing is just cutting 4 octaves of solid chimes and 2.5 of hollow chimes. And then I can arrange them in any chord structure that I want. And when I finally recorded with those, it still wasn't the image that I had in my mind. I ended up adding a couple auto harp tracks, a Suzuki omnichord track, and then some arpeggios off of a Fismo, like in kind of the higher end, to get the sound that I had envisioned in my mind. So sometimes I spend, months thinking or developing something, cutting pieces of metal out for this vision in my head, and ultimately it comes down to using other gear that I already had or a combination of that.
Sure. Amazing. It's hard to even imagine putting, I think for a lot of us, it's even difficult imagining the idea of kind of committing months to the creation of a track because you're having to build the instrumentation as you're working. But it's a fascinating view at the way you make your work. So I really do appreciate you sharing that with us. Well, with that, unfortunately, our time is up. I want to thank you again so much for taking the time to have the discussion. For people who want to learn more about your work, where do you like them to start?
Definitely artoftravelog.com, which goes to that blogspot page. Yeah. My Bandcamp or SoundCloud page has plenty of example tracks of my work over the years. And like you mentioned earlier, I think a lot of people have a hard time finding me because I do have some stuff under Jon Sonnenberg, some recordings and some releases, but I also have stuff under Pivot Cloud, an old kind of industrial band that I was a part of, or House of Wires, which was another band that I was a part of, or Travelogue. So almost all of these things, if you do a search, you'll find plenty of stuff on, especially in conjunction with my name. Unfortunately, with the internet and its growth, a lot of things like House of Wires or Travelogue,
a little harder to search for, right?
Yeah, you know, you look at a band like, you know, the Drums, and you wonder how anybody ever finds anything.
Yeah, I actually used to interact with the band called The Samples. I was like, man, you can't even imagine a worse name for online searching at this point, right?
Yeah, and a lot of people are getting around that by putting V's for U's and things like that. But then it just leads to a bunch of kids that can't spell anything.
although your Pivot Cloud thing is kind of that's an appropriately easy to search for thing, assuming that you get the typing right. So
that's true. And Cloud, CLOWJ, really has no equivalent word in any language. So that was kind of a score for us.
Indeed. Well, Jon, thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to let you have the rest of your day.
Hey, and by the way, happy birthday.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it, man. Many thanks to Jon for having the great discussion. It was really great to hear about all the different aspects of how he does what he does, whether it's development of songs or the creation of instrumentation. All kind of comes from the same creative location for him, so it's really interesting to learn more about that. I want to thank you, the listeners, for continuing to support me. I want to especially thank the people that are Patreon subscribers. This month we did really great. We're able to cover all the costs of the site, plus all the transcription service costs, so it's super helpful to me. I want to thank each and every one of the patrons. If you are interested in supporting, please get over to patreon.com/Darwin Gross and sign up. There are some extras for people. Everybody that signs up gets some additional information. In fact, there are higher tiers than where you get extra audio and video material as well. So I hope that you'll consider signing up. But in any case, please continue to listen. Share this with your friends, family, people that might be interested. And thank you so much for your ongoing support. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, it's darwin.gross@gmail.com or ddg@cycling74.com or ddg@20objects.com. All those will get to me. Thanks a lot, and we'll catch you next time around. Bye.